Hey, check this out. You know what Eric asked me when I got into work this morning?
I have no idea. What do you ask you?
He asked me if I felt the earthquake last night.
Earthquake? You gotta be kidding. I didn't feel an earthquake.
I know, that's what I said. He told me it actually woke him up last night. You know,
What?
yeah, it was like it happened at like 4:42 in the morning, so we must have been sleeping. But I mean, it's possible that, even if we had been awake, we might not have felt it because, maybe it wasn't felt, this far north. But I mean, I thought he was pulling my leg when he first talked about it.
Well, I guess that's not so far-fetched considering we live on a major fault line here.
Yeah, but actually, I think this earthquake was on a different fault line, because Eric lives uh, just south of San Jose,
Yeah.
and the earthquake he said was due east of San Jose, so he was obviously a lot closer to the epicenter than we were. So I'm not even sure it was felt here.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I've experienced quite a few earthquakes in the past several years, but I've been living here now a little over 2 years. I think I've only experienced one here. It was really strange too. I should say each earthquake has been a completely different experience. But the one I felt here, I was standing outside a restaurant talking to AJ and another friend, and all of a sudden it just felt like this shift. It's really hard to explain, but it made me think of like a cartoon, like how in the cartoon, like buildings might just shift to the right and then shift right back.
Yeah, without falling.
Yeah, without falling. And I had no idea what was going on for a few minutes afterwards, and then I realized, oh, that must have been an earthquake.
Yeah, you know what I usually notice? The times that I've been at home here
Yeah.
and there's been an earthquake, it's almost as if there's this really big train or like a gigantic Mack truck going by, and suddenly I start to hear the heater shaking, and it's like the noise is like is loud for like a second, and then it's gone. So
That's
it's really
so,
weird. It's almost like the first couple of times I felt it, I wasn't even aware it was an earthquake while it was happening.
well, that's so funny you say that because one that I experienced in Bangkok, it actually was after the tsunami. And so later I found out that it was aftershock from the tsunami. But anyway, I was in a building up on the ninth floor, and suddenly there was all this rattling, and I'm thinking to myself, it was so irrational. I'm thinking to myself, God, there's like a train going by, and I can't believe that this building is shaking so much from the train. And of course, a train wouldn't have made a building, or at least me up on the ninth floor, feel something to that effect. And I think it happened about two times. And that one wasn't until several days later when I was talking to people and they were like, "Oh, did you feel the earthquake?" Then it dawned on me, "Oh, that was an earthquake."
Yeah,
It
I
was,
know. It's crazy how when you're not used to feeling them, you could think it's something else.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, totally.
I've been living here for a while now, and I've definitely felt my share of earthquakes. I mean, when you live here, it's a given that you're going to experience earthquakes. You just hope that you're not going to be here for the big one, you
Yeah,
know?
right.
When I first moved here, it was about 5 years after the Loma Prieta earthquake, which was a very big earthquake here. And there are a lot of people who lived here who I met who had actually been living in the area when the earthquake hit. So it was interesting to get their perspective. And
Oh,
it also like made me remember where I was when I heard about the Loma Prieta earthquake. I was watching the World Series on TV, and it was taking place in San Francisco. So as I'm watching it, suddenly the announcer starts saying, "Wow, I think we're feeling an earthquake here," and the cameras started shaking, and all of a sudden the TV coverage cut out. So, I wanted to get a rundown what happened. So I turned to the news station, and within a few minutes, they were discussing this gigantic earthquake that had hit San Francisco, and they started showing pictures maybe 30 minutes later of these people who were trying to weed through the rubble of these buildings that had been like coming down. So I mean, it
Oh,
was pretty
wow.
scary. I'll tell you what,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, well, the 3 months I was living in Japan, I experienced two. Both of those were very different from the one I'd experienced here, and also very different from the one in Bangkok. But one of them, I was actually up in my apartment, which was on the fifth floor of a building, and I was woken up at about 5 o'clock in the morning to the building swaying. And because earthquakes are like a dime a dozen in Japan, they've built a lot of their buildings to absorb the shock. So that's why it was swaying. It was a very surreal feel.
Hi, this is Kristen.
Hello. Hello, and welcome to the Point of View stories for earthquakes. I'm going to tell the same story from the earthquakes mini story lesson in a number of different ways. Each time I tell the story, I'll change the time in which the story is being told, or I will change the person who is telling the story. So we'll hear it from a different point of view. Let's start by telling the story as if it is happening right now, or as we say, in the present. Okay. Luke lives in San Francisco. Luke can eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke tells his friend George. George thinks this seems far-fetched. He thinks that Luke is pulling his leg. "You've gotta be kidding," he says to Luke. So Luke bets George $100 that he can eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke eats 15 eggs in the first 10 minutes, then all of a sudden, the ground starts to shake. There is an earthquake due east of San Francisco. Luke is not surprised because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. "When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake," Luke says. "Totally," George says. Then Luke eats the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George has to give him $100. Okay. So that ends the story being told as if it is happening right now. Next, let's hear the story as if it happened 7 months ago. 7 months ago, Luke lived in San Francisco. Luke could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke told his friend George. George thought this seemed far-fetched. He thought that Luke was pulling his leg. "You've got to be kidding," he said to Luke. So Luke bet George $100 that he could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke ate 15 eggs in the first 15 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, the ground started to shake. There was an earthquake due east of San Francisco. Luke was not surprised because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. "When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake," said Luke. "Totally," said George. Then Luke ate the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George had to give him $100. Okay. So that is the story as if it's happening in the past, or it's already happened. Now let's tell the story as if it is happening in the future. So we think of the story happening, say, 4 years from now. Okay, here we go. In 4 years, Luke's going to be living in San Francisco. Luke will be able to eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke's going to tell his friend George. George will think this seems far-fetched. He'll think that Luke is pulling his leg. "You've got to be kidding," he'll say to Luke. So Luke's gonna bet George $100 that he'll be able to eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. Luke's gonna eat 15 eggs in the first 10 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, the ground will start to shake. There is going to be an earthquake due east of San Francisco. Luke will not be surprised, because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake, Luke will say. Totally, George will say. Then Luke will eat the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George will have to give him $100. Okay, so that's the end of this version of the story. The version in which the story is in the future, where we talk about events that are going to happen or events that will happen. Now, I'd like you to notice that instead of saying something like George will think, we shorten it in normal conversation by saying George'll think. Basically, we combine the words George and will into George'll. This is more like how we would say it using spoken English. But, say, in a textbook, you would be more likely to see George will instead of seeing George'll. You also probably noticed that when we convert the word can into the future, we usually say is able to. For example, Luke can eat 50 eggs is changed to Luke will be able to eat 50 eggs. Alright, now let's hear the story from Luke's point of view. So this is the story that's going to be told by Luke. Okay, here we go. I used to live in San Francisco. I could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. I told my friend George. George thought that this seemed far-fetched. He thought that I was pulling his leg. You've got to be kidding, he said to me. So I bet George $100 that I could eat 50 eggs in 1 hour. I ate 15 eggs in the first 10 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, the ground started to shake. There was an earthquake due east of San Francisco. I wasn't surprised because earthquakes are a dime a dozen in San Francisco. When you live in San Francisco, it's a given that you will feel an earthquake, I said. Totally, said George. Then I ate the rest of the eggs in 22 minutes, so George had to give me $100. Okay, so that's our last story.